I think my context is that the global economy and the global world system, the entire status quo, is entering a new era, which I call an era of scarcity, which is different categorically from the era that we've had for 75 years of abundance. And the abundance has not just been in that there's plenty of resources, it's also been affordable, like it's been low cost. And so as costs rise for a variety of reasons, and scarcity impacts the global economy, then the sort of model of growth at any cost is broken. It's not going to work anymore. And so we're in this vast, complex transition of eras. And of course, that's very confusing and complex because people who are benefiting from the current system are going to fight to keep it as it is, right? And then the forces of adaptation and evolution are trying to sort out what's the best way forward. And so on top of all this, I'm also seeing that the metrics we use are basically like a horse-drawn carriage from 1890. I mean, GDP, corporate profits, how we measure growth and prosperity, they're really so outdated that they're not really helping us. And so we need to develop an entirely new set of metrics to help guide us. So I'd say we're in for a period of turmoil, which is not all bad. In other words, when you're going to make a huge transition, whether it's a household or an enterprise or a nation or the global economy, you're going to go through a lot of ups and downs as this gets sorted out. And there'll be winners and losers, and that's really what we're talking about today. The thing about ideologies is they're kind of quick and dirty, right? You kind of buy into the idea that if this is ideal were only reached, everything would be great, So we see that in socialism, capitalism, Bitcoin, everybody's, if only it was implemented correctly, everything would be fantastic. But the real world is actually maps much more closely a system. In other words, there's inputs, and then there's processes that go on that work on those inputs, and then you get an output. And so that to me makes a lot more sense in terms of trying to be predictive in a useful fashion, right? Either you change the inputs, or you change the processes, or you change both of them, or you're going to get the same output. So, and it also helps us break down all the different complexities that we deal with and try to group them into categories that we can understand. We can't understand, hundreds of millions of inputs, but we can if we break them down into a systemic kind of understanding, then we can kind of start making sense of things that are actually very complicated. And so that's why I kind of favor systems. I think my basic perspective is that when you centralize power, which goes along with centralizing wealth, then those at the top tend to naturally want to maintain the system in the stasis, the fixed kind of the way it is now works for us, so let's keep it this way. And you can see that in like imperial China, the rise and fall of various dynasties. In other words, from a very long point of view, we see this in city states going back, 3,000-4,000 years, and nation states and empires. They all kind of fall into this trap of when they centralize power too aggressively, and there's no longer competition, competition both economically, politically, socially. Then you basically suppressed natural selection, right? The society and the economy no longer have the means to adapt and evolve as conditions change. And so I'll give you a real world example today, I think, which is Michael Pettis, who's an expert on China and based in China, has done a good job explaining to the rest of us we get trapped in these legacy systems, which in China's case was the model of development that they chose was very heavily dependent on real estate, right? Building a lot of apartments. And of course, they needed housing. They were an underdeveloped country. And so all this made terrific sense in the 1980s and 90s. But it actually ended up being tied into these legacy systems, like the local governments are largely funded by selling the rights to development And so they're trapped now in this system because there's so many legacy players who are politically, very powerful, who's saying, this is the model that works for us, let's keep it. But it's like, there's something like between 30 and 50 million empty flats in China that are just, sort of like holders for excess capital. And so that's not necessarily healthy for the Chinese. The era of scarcity is driven, I think, by one pattern, which we can go back and look at history, and many historians have done this, Peter Turchin, for example, that humans over the course of civilization tend to increase their consumption, increase their population up to the level of their resources that they have. So things are terrific when you discover a new resource, right? And then it's a era of prosperity, everything's abundant and cheap and everything's fantastic. And then the population and consumption rises up and starts soaking up that. And then if there's any sort of diminishment of those resources for climate change, which is a common element, the little ice age in the 1600s was one of the factors that created like 30 years of war in Europe, right? And so we see that these changes occur and it's on an almost a cyclical basis, right? And so there's that element of human history. Then there's the other part of we've become so good at consuming vast resources that we're depleting the cheap, easy stuff. Doesn't mean it's gone, but it just means that it's going to be more expensive to go into places that don't have any roads, that are far from harbors, for example, and you're going to have to build an entire infrastructure to get to that mountain, to tear it down, to get the lithium, and you need tons of fresh water and so on and so forth. All the easy stuff's been done, and so there's that. And then there's geopolitical tension, which is also a historical pattern. Now that resources are scarce or perceived to be scarce or more expensive, then now there's going to be geopolitical conflict over who gets to control those resources. The other elements are that the growth at any cost kind of economy that we have, that we've developed kind of by legacy abundance. I call it the waste is growth landfill economy, because we don't really differentiate between wasting resources. That's growth too. And as people like to say, when something burns down, it's good for GDP, right? And a million cars sitting in a traffic jam going nowhere, that's burning more fuel. That's a growth element too. So we need to differentiate between investing resources and getting more out of them. In other words, instead of just waste is growth. And then that's, of course, part of the planned obsolescence. How do you make more money? Well, you force your consumers to buy a new product every 2 years. And then that ends up in the landfill. Like, we don't really recycle much of our industrial waste.